Welcome to The Learning Landscape, a podcast that seeks to encourage and equip school educators. My name is Simon Matthews, and this podcast is proudly brought to you by Independent Schools Tasmania. In today's episode, we're turning our attention to one of the most pressing questions facing schools right now: how to understand and strengthen student engagement before problems show up in attendance, behaviour or achievement data. I'm really pleased to be joined by Owen Carter, the co-founder and director at ImpactEd Group, to explore the work of the Education Engagement Taskforce and what it could mean for Australian schools. So, Owen, welcome to The Learning Landscape.
Welcome, pleasure to be with you.
Owen, let's begin by trying to understand what problem the Education Engagement Taskforce is trying to solve and why student engagement matters so much right now in Australian schools.
Yeah, of course. And one of the things that we've been really conscious of is trying to be clear what we're talking about when we're talking about engagement. So when we're talking about education engagement, what we're talking about is the level of commitment, involvement, and emotional investment an individual has with a school or educational setting. And there's really strong evidence, both internationally, within the UK and within Australia, suggesting that engagement and the level of engagement, particularly that young people have with their educational setting, is profoundly linked to a variety of long-term outcomes, including fairly obviously attendance at school, but also long-term examination outcomes as well. So the challenge we're trying to address is that pretty much across the board in Australia, there are a real number of issues that you can see with educational engagement. That's reflected in attendance data. You know, you've got really challenging issues around close to 40% of young people attending school less than 90% of the time nationally. And, you know, school leaders report to us very consistently challenges around behaviour and other factors that seem to have disengagement at their heart. So what we're really trying to do with the Education Engagement Task Force is two things. One is develop a methodology for measuring the different components of student engagement, and we hope over time education engagement for other stakeholders as well, in Australian settings, so that we can give schools much more precise information about what's driving engagement or disengagement in their setting. And then two, how can we build the evidence base around what practices, strategies, approaches work to build really strong cultures of engagement that ultimately improve young people's experience of school, and then ultimately the long-term outcomes that they go on to experience as well.
Well, the task force draws on a really large UK study of over 100,000 students. Give us a brief understanding of what you're seeing there and what convinced you that this approach might be worth adapting for an Australian context.
Yeah. So in the UK, ImpactEd Group sponsored a very large project, as you mentioned, Mind the Engagement Gap, which looked at engagement in a sample of several hundred schools and over 100,000 students. And it's delivered by the engagement platform or TEP, a digital tool that was developed specifically for this purpose. And what we saw there were a number of quite sobering findings, if I'm honest. One, the real decline in engagement that you tend to see over the course of a child's time in education. So particularly the drop-off in the first year of secondary school being quite striking. We also saw a lot of socioeconomic disparity in terms of engagement and significant concerns to do with actually experienced by gender as well. So real issues around anxiety and well-being with girls in particular. What was really potent about that work in the UK is we weren't just describing the problem. We were also helping schools look at this data in their setting, and then through the engagement platform TEP, giving them reports and support to help them act on and improve that. So when we started having conversations with leaders in Australia, and we're delivering the task force in collaboration with Social Ventures Australia, who are our kind of core partner for the project, what we found was that many of the system challenges were the same. So you know, the UK and Australia share a number of unfortunate challenges around issues with student attendance, around other cases of engagement. Actually, a large-scale PISA study found that both UK and Australia saw over 40% declines in students reporting that their teachers cared about them post-COVID. So a real kind of unfortunate challenge shared by both systems. But encouragingly, that there was also a similar premise that if we could give schools more timely information on these factors, then it might be able to help them take informed action. So we really heard from school leaders working in close collaboration with Social Ventures Australia that there was a real chance to, I suppose, get beyond just the kind of annual survey type activity to something a bit more regular, a bit more targeted, and that ultimately could inform more specific and precise action. So that was really our kind of motivation, as if we can get that right, then we can help give school leaders some of the tools to positively influence engagement, and therefore, move those long-term outcomes and life chances that are, why everyone is in this profession in the first place.
I love it that the work you're doing is not just giving timely data, but it's also saying, and here are some things that we think you can do to move the dial positively. Now, it's interesting, in your project, you talk about engagement as a lead indicator rather than a lag indicator. Just help us understand that a little bit more.
Yeah, so the premise, I suppose, for this is that a lot of the data we look at in the school system is backwards looking. It's information that we get that helps us understand how students have performed. The classic examples would be your NAPLAN results, or your other major assessments that you might do. Well, those things are the culmination of a whole bunch of inputs that have gone into that. The quality of instruction in the classroom, students' engagement and attendance in lessons, variety of other factors. So we talk about engagement as a lead indicator because it dips first. In other words, you start to see movements in engagement, either positively or negatively, before other indicators start to move. And therefore, if you can intervene really timely when it comes to engagement, then you might be able to address issues before they start affecting long-term outcomes. So just two examples from our UK data. We found that students in the top 25% of engagement are around 10 percentage points less likely to be persistently absent than those in the bottom 25%. So attendance is strikingly higher, particularly in secondary schools. We also found that sense of agency, which is kind of one of the factors we look at in our engagement survey, is associated with 2 additional months reading progress. So what we're starting to get from it is a sense that if you can get this information early, then it can be something that you intervene on early. And that's why we talk about it as a lead indicator, something that starts to move before those other longer term outcomes take a bit longer to move.
It's interesting that the engagement model looks at emotional and cognitive and behavioural investments. Why do you think it's so important to look at all of those dimensions, not just one or two?
Yeah, we think that engagement has probably suffered in the past from being overly identified with just one of those dimensions of engagement. It's very common, for example, that when you talk about student engagement, people sometimes hear well-being and mental health. And well-being and mental health is one very important aspect of student engagement, but student engagement for us is a much more holistic concept. So, as you pointed out, we talk about emotional engagement, and that's probably the element that people may be most familiar with. That's like the quality of relationships that a young person has with their peers or with their teachers. Cognitive engagement, which is, are students actually interested in what they're learning? Are they engaging with the curriculum? Are they mentally applying themselves? And then behavioral engagement. Are they not causing low-level disruption in the classroom? Are students also applying themselves and trying hard for their work? So it's bringing those three elements together that the research evidence suggests are all important contributors to overall engagement, and understanding that these factors are intrinsically interconnected. In other words, you can have a very positive and caring culture, but if the level of disruption in the classroom is such that young people don't feel safe, that's going to be really challenging for engagement. Also, if your curriculum and the quality of your instruction isn't keeping kind of students cognitively present, that's also going to have implications for their other forms of engagement. So it's the interconnectedness of those that we thought was really important, and also the precision around language. So starting to be able to help school leaders drill into, well, which specific aspects of engagement are maybe stronger or weaker in my setting. That starts to become a bit more actionable than just kind of, overall, do students seem positively engaged or not, which is much less tangible.
Yeah, it seems that the way you've designed the project, you're able to be, as you say, really specific about what particular elements are perhaps really strong in a school and where there might be some areas that need attention. Help us understand a little bit more about how the project not just gives really good insight, really good data, but actually supports schools to move into acting on that data, and they're not just collecting another data set. This is actually something that informs action that we know in most cases makes a difference.
Absolutely. And it's really worth saying we're very conscious of the risk of data overload and data overwhelm. It's so vitally important that if you're going to the trouble of really drilling into engagement data, that you then have the resources and support to translate that into action. So the way that the project is structured is around regular census windows. So all schools participating in the project will conduct a student engagement survey at least twice a year, and we encourage 3 times a year. And that starts to build a regular rhythm for this throughout the school year. What that means is that at each of those census points where they have the data that's emerging from the project, a member of the tech team who are working with the schools will be on hand. So that's the first element. It is really crucial, I think, to have someone who is able to talk to you and have a conversation about the data. Typically the data is a starting point for questions, it's not the end point. So being able to have that named person, that dedicated partnership manager who can work with you to explore what the insight from your school might be saying. The second thing is around the kind of supporting resources. So the advantage of having what is an increasingly growing cohort of Australian schools across all sectors and in multiple states involved is then being able to go, well, what can we learn from other settings as well? So if you're a school that has, a real challenge in, let's say, the quality of students' effort in the classroom, what can we learn from other schools who have maybe improved that or who are very strongly performing in that aspect? So we're building a bank of supporting resources, best practices that will help schools look at where they might go for inspiration about addressing challenges that they experience. And then the third element is around the kind of communities of practice work, and this is really exciting for us. So, the TEP team are working with the schools to help them look at the data individually. But again, because the pilot is geographically focused and operating within specific clusters of schools, we then also want to create the opportunity for schools to come together, share lessons, share successes, share things that haven't worked as well. So again, building that regularity around this data. So as you say, it's not just a data collection exercise, it's part of a continuous practice whereby people are reflecting, talking about it, and most crucially learning from what has or hasn't worked in other settings, I think is the key to making this successful.
Oh, and it sounds fantastic. And I bet that there are school leaders listening to this thinking, how do I get in? I want to be involved in the project. What do I need to do? Can you just give us a bit of a heads up of what a school leader could actually do if they're interested in exploring this further?
Yeah, of course. So, very simple. So, first is either drop me an email, and Simon, feel free to share that in the kind of show notes or when this podcast is distributed. You can also make an inquiry via the TEP website. If you search for the engagement platform or TEP, you'll be able to access the inquiry form there. We're at a really exciting stage now where we've done our first cohort in November with 25 pilot schools, and we're expanding to around 70 in the next cohort and then growing from there. What that means is that there's an opportunity for schools to get involved at this stage. That's also heavily subsidised for schools, thanks to generous funding contributions from our philanthropic partners and our collaboration with Social Ventures Australia. So we aim to keep costs at a minimum barrier to schools who are looking to participate. The main thing to be aware of is obviously that commitment to doing regular student engagement surveys. So you need to have the capacity to support that. But most importantly, I suppose, the willingness and openness to act on the data. So as part of that, process that I was describing, the kind of curiosity to go, what can we learn from that? But the good news is, we're finding that there is a really encouraging groundswell of schools who are very purposeful about doing this work, and obviously we'd love schools from any sector and any phase to express interest, and we can hopefully get you involved.
Fabulous. It sounds exciting and generous, and we thank you for your work. Oh, and finally, if this project is successful, what's your big hope for how Australian schools understand and respond to student engagement, perhaps in 5 years' time?
Big question. My hope is that this stuff starts to become part of a common language and a regular cycle. So we know that many schools are doing great things already around student engagement. But from my experience working with schools both in the UK and in Australia, often when student engagement is discussed, it's in the context of kind of generalized anxiety, a sense that things aren't quite as they should be. So I'd really love to see more specificity on, well, which aspects of engagement are we struggling with, or which aspects are we doing well on? That starts to become much more actionable and something that you can actually influence. What we see from the UK data, and we're starting to see it from the Australian data as well, is there is actually lots of variance. There are schools that are doing amazing things and showing consistently higher engagement than other settings. The great schools are doing something really different on this. So this is something that is in the capacity of school leaders to influence and change. So my big hope is it becomes part of the language, it becomes part of the regular dialogue, it becomes part of the school improvement processes, and it becomes something that hopefully school leaders over time show an increased sense of agency and ability to affect, rather than it just seeing like another challenge amongst a variety of challenges.
Well, Owen, thanks for the work that you're doing to build the research and the evidence base. That's fabulous, and we look forward to seeing the fruit of that down the track. But thanks also for making time in your evening in the UK to join us and share more about the research you're doing. So thank you very much.
Absolute pleasure. Thank you, Simon.
And that brings us to the close of this episode of The Learning Landscape. Thank you for listening. We appreciate you taking the time to learn alongside us today. If you've enjoyed this episode, please don't forget to give us a rating and review, and perhaps share this podcast with your network. Your feedback and support mean the world to us and help others to find this resource as well. So we look forward to talking to you next time. Thanks.